Panel. I'm Categorical Grant.
Cool.
Let's dive into this. Let's go. So I've been watching the show since the summer of 2012. I kept getting these suggested YouTube videos, and I didn't quite understand what they were. And finally I clicked on one called Party.move. And that was the end of that. So I was like, wait, this is a show? Wait, what? And
now you're here.
And now I'm here. So thanks to Hot Diggity Demon, I guess. So I've been writing since 2014. And I actually very pathetically only started writing because I decided I was like, I'm going to write a romance story about my then girlfriend's OC and my OC, and it was really bad, and I published it, and it was really bad. And then later I'm like, maybe I'll write real things. So yeah, I think probably 2015 is when I really started churning out the quality stuff, and I've been doing it ever since. So why should you listen to me? You know, what do I know? Well, you shouldn't listen to me. But if you choose to, there should be reasoning behind it. So more than half of my stories have been featured on FimFiction, on the featuring site, and there have been several, I think 7 or 8 have been featured at #1 for a period of time. So I know what people like. I know how to get popular, you know, at least in the sense of get your stuff out there, maybe not personally popular, but and you know, I think I have a pretty good. I mean, it's interesting to think about. You don't think about it until you really get into it and come back to it. But my stories have been viewed over 100,000 times, and you really think about, you know, how many people out there, 100,000 people see their writing. You know, that's pretty cool. Maybe not 100,000 different people.
Maybe
but
50,000 people read it twice.
Yeah, whatever it is. Even if it's 10,000 people having read it 10 times, that's still impressive. You know.
Yeah.
So I had a little bit of experience about this, and you know, we'll get this figured out. So. I'm a biochemist, as it stands right now by profession. Graduated from college in January, semester early, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. I do work on spectroscopy, if you guys want to talk about that, which you don't, unless you do, in which case hit me up afterward. I'm going to be going to medical school in August. This is a small enough panel so I can take a break the news. It's not official yet. I have till the end of the month, but I'll be going to Northwestern in downtown Chicago. So I'm pretty happy about that. And one day, some poor sap's life's going to be in my hands, so that'll be great. I'm also a Christian. You know, relationship with Jesus Christ is actually pretty big in my life, and sometimes because of that, I like to put in themes about like love and forgiveness in the stories. And then maybe the most important thing is I'm a local. I grew up 20 minutes from here. My first conventions in 2015 and 2016 were the My Little Pony fairs held in this exact hotel.
You didn't even have to book a hotel.
Exactly.
You just drove.
My man Alex is staying with me at my parents' house. So it was literally we rolled out of bed. He played with my puppy. I like scarfed down a yogurt, and like we left at like 10:30, and we were here at like 10:50. Like, so if you guys want any advice on food or any other stuff around the area that you would like to, you know, I'm your guy.
I'm just trying to find it cheap.
Find it cheap. Well,
That's.
and Schaumburg is kind of my stomping grounds. This was kind of the weekend, you know. I do all my Christmas shopping at the mall across the street. It's always hectic, so rock and roll. What time is it? I should have a timer going, shouldn't I?
Yes.
All right, we've been 4 minutes in, so we burned good time. All right, so we're going to go over just sort of an overview of what's going to happen today. I'll talk about the elements that are in a story, how you can make them good. Then we're going to move on to how to write a quality story. So you moving on from, oh, I have a story, to how to make my story good. And then we're going to go to posting it online, which you got to eventually do if you want to get out there. Then we're going to go to becoming more popular, which is how do I take my quality stories and make them into quality stories that people are actually going to read. And that's a little trickier, but with a little practice, it gets easy. Then we'll go into a couple of examples of good stories. We can chat about those. I'm sure you've heard of at least one of them, and probably several. And then we'll have a questions and answer period, and maybe even, if we have time, get into some funny parts of Fix. So figure it out. So, question for the audience. What is the hardest part of writing a story? And yes, there is an objective correct answer.
Starting it.
Okay, fair. What is the hardest element of the story that's to write?
Dialogue?
Very close. What is dialogue between?
Characters.
Characters are the hardest part of any literature. They're the subject of everything. They are your sort of place to have symbolism. They're your place for meaning, for your readers connect with them. But the great news about writing My Little Pony fan fiction is that Lauren Faust has already done the work. The hardest part is over.
Well, now you
We
have to
already
show
have
me
great characters to work with. So it's phenomenal to be able to sit at that starting point. And the other thing about it is, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I don't write because I like writing, I write because I like ponies. And like, I'm not gonna grow up to be a writer, I'm going into medicine, I'll be a professor of medicine somewhere, infectious disease, I'd love to keep going if people keep reading, but that's the only reason I'm doing this is for the ponies in the first place. So, the way you write the characters in the show, in your fix, should be two things. Number one, loyal to the general idea of the character. Nothing gets dumped on harder on the internet than someone who writes a character and does it either in a way that's completely not at all like the character is, or in a way that just doesn't have any personality whatsoever. People will often write romance fictions where there's just no personality to any of the characters. They have personality, you need to think about those things. One of the things I'd also say is you can also develop My Little Pony characters further in your story if you see a good opportunity to do so. I'll go into that a little later. There's a great example I have towards the end of that, but that's another possibility. As long as you're not trampling on things that are already established, there's a good opportunity to actually develop a little further, because not everything can be touched on in a 20-minute episode of a kid's show. You can put OCs in your stories, but you got to be really careful. Number one, you got to develop them yourself, and you have to do a good job of it. And number two, it's sort of a yellow flag for readers, especially if the OC is the primary purpose of the story, just because they don't know. I mean, they're going on FimFiction or whatever because they like to read about ponies, and they haven't figured out this, your OCs in this, and they go, who's that? So, now people have pulled it off. There's a number of great OCs out there. You see, you can get art of OCs up in the vendor hall. They'll tell you how popular some are, but you have to be careful. Yeah, Blackjack, there you go.
You wear them every suit. Hey, what's wrong with Blackjack?
Nothing wrong with it. He's holding up Blackjack. That's what I'm saying. So, moving on to plot. I differentiate between plot and conflict. Plot is like what actually happens. So that's what happens. So I think it's important for your plot to be interesting, to hook the reader, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, if you guys have any questions on the actual slide that I'm on, feel free to just raise your hand. I'll get you. If you have more general stuff, you can wait to the end and we'll hit it up. Conflict is different. So conflict is really the obstacle in the story that needs to be overcome, is I guess the easiest way to put it. So you have pony versus pony, so two ponies in an argument be an example of that. Pony versus world, where there's sort of this titanic struggle going on. You have a pony versus environment. Maybe Fluttershy has to be at a rock concert for some reason, and that's going to be rough for her to deal with. Even a pony versus self. A good example of this would be anyone dealing with their past, or some aspect of themselves they don't like, etc. And conflict makes stories interesting and fun. And I think that's really the key to having a good plot. Yeah.
This actually might be targeted towards you.
Gotcha.
What about stories that are what would be called fluff? Like the cuddle fix that you use.
The cuddle fix that, right?
What
So
would be telling me the conflict?
the plot. So I would say that there's not a lot of conflict in those stories, and that's the reason that they're not necessarily plot driven. They're character driven and interaction driven. Plot. There still is a plot, in the stories. Maybe in the conflict, for instance, in Cold Outside, you could have pony versus person versus pony, right? And I want to go, no, you don't. There's always a little bit of that, but I think those are less general. That's a good example of something that's not necessarily plot driven. But generally speaking, this is fair. So we're going to go into some examples of conflict. I got 3 examples, and we'll go through each one, and we're going to think about what's good and what's bad about it. So, number 1, Pinkie Pie bakes a cake.
Okay.
It has plot, but there is no conflict. You can write a story about Pinkie Pie baking a cake. It's just like it's like a daily vlog of what she's doing. If you like vlogs, great. But a lot of people, that's not quite enough to hook them. Number 2, Pinkie Pie's baking a cake, but she runs out of milk and has to pick some up before she finishes. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we have an example of an actual conflict where Pinkie Pie has to overcome a lack of resources to bake her cake. So now there's a little bit more spice. That being said, there's still nothing to really keep the reader there. It's a very mundane sort of conflict. Now, what if we have something extra special that's going to grab the reader's attention? Pinkie Pie's baking a cake, she runs out of milk, there's no milk at the store, and she becomes convinced that Fluttershy is behind a cow rights conspiracy to keep milk away from her.
Oh, God.
Now we have the basis for an excellent comedy story. Maybe at the end you could even have Fluttershy actually be behind it. Maybe it's not all in Pinkie's head. But in either way, I would have to say that number one, it's very consistent with who the characters are. Pinkie Pie becoming overly paranoid, we've seen that a bunch of times. Fluttershy loving animals, you know. We have sort of a consistency there. We have a really funny pony versus pony conflict that's brewing here. And it turns a mundane activity into something that you would expect to see on the show. So that's an example of 3 types of conflict, and you always should be aiming for that third sort of conflict. If you can get to the second one, that's always better than the first one. You know, not everyone can write something really, really, really creative and special, or if you're writing something specific, maybe it doesn't work, but that's a good example. So, the setting. We also have a world that's been created for us, which is great, because we don't have to do a lot of work in creating the world. Equestria and Earth are obviously the 2 most prominent locations of a lot of these things, or whatever Earth is in Equestria Girls. I don't know if that's really Earth. I don't know what the deal is with that. And sort of below that, you also have to think of where in Equestria or where in Earth you want your story to take place. So, Ponyville, if you want a small town setting. Canterlot, maybe something going on with the princesses. Manhattan, is it a city thing? Is it some of the Rarities boutique? Whatever. Another often overlooked part of setting is time. Time is also important in setting. Not everything is present day, and not everything is the current point in the series. Maybe you want to do a story that takes place before Twilight gets wings. Maybe you want to do a story 1,000 years ago before Luna was banished to the moon. Maybe you want to do something in the future. So that's also something to take into account when you're planning sort of your setting of your story. Even within Ponyville, or even within the places, there are other places you could go. The Friendship Castle, Sugar Cube Corner. Maybe if you're looking for a sort of, you know, nice kind of cozy story that focuses on dialogue between a couple of characters, maybe you have it in Fluttershy's Cottage, Fluttershy and Discord, you know, having tea together, and it's kind of a very nice, you know. So the setting should really reflect sort of what you want to get out of the story. And then there's obviously crossover locations. Like if you're writing like a fan fiction, you can have like, oh yes, and then we're on the Ark in Halo 3 and Pinkie Pie's there because why not? And you know, if you're into that, you're into that, and you need to have that. So
or you can jump on the Fallout Equestria bandwagon.
Yes, exactly. You know, which I guess Fallout Equestria is in Equestria, but it's just new.
It's the waste.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's an
how it
example of a
works.
future, more of a time.
200 years in the future.
Place. Yeah.
Yep.
And it's the zebras instead of the Chinese.
Yes.
It's strange. So, point of view is next. So the point of view that you're writing the story from should be influenced by what you want the reader to feel and experience. That, I cannot get that point across enough. There are a lot of people that are writers that say, for instance, okay, let me go over this first. So first person is writing from the perspective of I. It would be like a journal, effectively, a reporter's account, etc. Second person is you. So like a choose your own adventure story is an excellent example of that. You do this, you do that, etc. And then third person is from the perspective of a fly on the wall, or from an omniscient narrator, or from a limited narrator, whatever it is. So what I would say here is that, like a lot of my Coddle stories, for instance, are written in the second person, because I want the viewer to feel and experience the idea of hugging a pony, right? And I can just write a story where I said, I hugged a pony, and that's kind of like nuts to you guys. I get to hug a pony and you don't. You know, that's not a good point of view to have in a story. So, you know, that's something to experience. A third person is great for when you want to add context to events. Usually, like a first person, you would only be able to, say, give the sort of a commentary on events that are occurring from one character's perspective. But if you want to, for instance, talk about the thoughts of both characters, you can do that from a third person, like omniscient perspective. I'd say tense is important too. You have present tense and past tense usually the main two. I guess you can write in future tense. I don't know why you would. But if you're telling a story, for instance, or it's coming from the perspective of a narrator telling a story, or one pony telling another pony a story in a story, past tense is usually correct. But you can also do present tense, as in this is happening now. Present tense works really well as second person fix. The narrator is the key to the story. The narrator gives voice to the words of the author, and how you write the narrator is going to be impacted by the genre, and that's going to impact your voice as well. So, theme. I forget who the author is, but there is a popular writer on FimFiction whose little bio description is just stories about ponies are stories about people. And that's entirely true. There's really no qualitative difference in terms of theme, writing stories about people like you would find in a regular book, and writing a bunch of pony fan fictions you find on the internet. So you really have to think about what are the human sort of problems that we can put into the pony book, and how do I want to tackle that? So the question is, what's your story about in a really figurative sense of the word? Elements are, I think the elements of harmony make excellent examples of themes. So you can have loyalty or kindness as a theme to your story. Maybe there's some sort of betrayal that happens, so loyalty would be a good theme there. Family, sacrifice, love, and forgiveness are a little more